To finish up Unit 3.6, we're going to talk about some larger trends that we see in the fossil record and then see if we can extend those generally to all history of life on Earth. Okay? Now, the problem with the fossil record is that it's fragmentary. It's like snapshots. Imagine that I tried to determine what your life was like only looking at social media. It's a very biased snapshot of your life, and obviously some people, like on Instagram, they only post the good things, right? They're not very honest. They don't post all the bad things, the medium things. They only post the great things or the things that they're pretending are great. And so I might get an idea about your life, but not maybe the complete picture, maybe even a little bit of an inaccurate picture by only looking at those snapshots. And the fossil record is also the same. And so if we only have a few remnants of species here and there, it can be very difficult to determine how things change over time. We can certainly see that they've changed, but we don't know whether it was a slow, gradual change or a rapid, dramatic change. So there are two patterns in the history of life on Earth that we want to be able to recognize. Cladogenesis, you can think of as speciation, so you can put that in parentheses. Cladogenesis is when one lineage historically breaks into two groups. Now, we don't call it speciation because even though at the time this would represent two species, each of these species may then go on to become entirely new large groups with many, many descendant species. So cladogenesis is a more general term. The other thing is anagenesis. And anagenesis is a change in a population over time without any new species breaking up. So even though we might see a form here 10 million years ago, it might not be the exact same form 10 million years later, but yet that's the same species that's just changed slowly and gradually over time. But if all we had was one record here of C and then another one of D without any of the changes along the way, we might say, oh look, C went extinct and D replaced it. Whereas in reality, species D and C are the same ones, just evolved and separated over time. So you can see how we might have difficulty determining and telling the whole story if we have just a very fragmentary fossil record. And so we try to rely on groups that have a much more complete fossil record. There are some organisms like mollusks with hard shells where we actually have quite a complete and continuous fossil record, and so we can say things about those. Now, there are two patterns that have been proposed for the evolution and diversification of different lineages. The first is phyletic gradualism. This is the idea that was espoused by Darwin, and it's still, many scientists are still supportive of this idea. And there's good evidence from the fossil record that this does occur in some groups. In phyletic gradualism, as the name implies, everything happens kind of slowly. Anagenesis is slow, tiny changes build up over time and make a big difference in the long run. Speciation occurs but kind of randomly with no clear pattern as to where and no clear pattern as to how fast those species diverge from one another. So this really is kind of Darwin's idea of natural selection and slow gradual changes, anagenesis, slow gradual speciation, the cladogenesis events. Now in contrast to that, we have down here at the bottom punctuated equilibrium. And punctuated equilibrium is a slightly different pattern. So here we have long-term stability of a species. So on this graph, we usually don't do this with phylogenies, but on this graph, the lateral movement of each of the lines represents anagenesis, change over time. So if you have a line going straight up, that means that species has changed very little over time. Whereas if it's meandering to the left or the right, it means it's changing. So here we have this central line of species that goes unchanged for millions of years. But at 2 points, a new species breaks off and it changes very, very rapidly. In fact, nearly instantaneously from a geological spectrum. Now this still might represent tens or 20,000 years, but that's just the blink of an eye geologically. And if we only have a few fossils, we're very unlikely to catch a fossil in this anagenic phase when it's changing from its ancestral species to a brand new species. And once it finds a favorable niche, it adapts very well and then stays unchanged for long periods of time. So this is punctuated equilibrium. And if we look at those groups that have complete records, this is one for a marine gastropod, we see that we have evidence for punctuated equilibrium. But the only reason we can do this is we have enough fossils that every once in a while we catch one during this change. I guess that's really the only one that's caught right in the middle. Others, are fairly stable. But we can see this and get a fairly clear pattern for punctuated equilibrium. Now, Darwin's ideas about natural selection fit the idea of phyletic gradualism very, very well. But is there a mechanism that we've talked about that might fit this pattern of punctuated equilibrium? I'll give you a hint. It's something we talked about during the speciation lecture. Do you remember peripheral speciation? So peripheral speciation is a form of allopatric speciation. It occurs when a small subgroup of a population breaks away, gets established in a new area like an island or maybe far away on the continent. It establishes a new population, and then because of its small size, you're going to have a biased sample, and then you're going to have strong genetic drift as that population takes some time to grow to a large size where there's very little genetic drift. Not only that, but you're in a brand new environment in many cases, so there's probably going to be strong natural selection. So you have these really strong increased forces of genetic drift, you have potentially strong new natural selection working on a population, and so that population will go through a rapid change, or anagenesis. Eventually it will adapt to its new environment and establish a stable population. So peripheral speciation would give rise to this pattern of punctuated equilibrium. Now, when we ask which one is the right model, the answer is really both. We see evidence of both in different groups. So sometimes groups evolve via phyletic gradualism, whereas other groups may evolve more like this punctuated equilibrium model. So both are valid and occur in different groups. Now, are there any trends that we can see across all life on Earth? To do this, we need to see, well, what do you mean by a trend? Well, a trend is a pattern that we see going in one direction over a long period of time. So we have a trend in the human species towards more and more integrated technology in our lives, right? Whereas if we go back 100 years ago, nearly everybody was only using technology a little bit, and now everybody is utilizing it in all different aspects. So that is a trend in technology. That type of trend we would refer to as an active trend, where every member of the population, or at least nearly every member of the population, changes over time in one direction. Okay? There can also be passive trends. And a passive trend occurs when we do see a change in a certain direction, but not all of the population changes, maybe only a subset. So an example of this, say over the last 50 years, if we look at the frequency of piercings, if we look at the population of a whole, we have more body piercings than we did 50 years ago. But there's still large segments of the population that remain relatively the same, and if we looked at their ancestors 2-3 generations back, they wouldn't have any more or less piercings than they do today. So that's a passive trend. So just be familiar with both passive and active trends. This is no trend at all. Everything is just kind of varying and spreading out. And so the question is, do we see any passive or active trends that we can apply to all life on Earth? And in the past, people have proposed ideas that perhaps increased morphological complexity is a trend. Perhaps efficiency, right? As organisms adapt and become more and more specialized, become more efficient. But yet when we look, there are always going to be organisms that break those rules. So in short, even though we can see both passive and active trends in subgroups of species, and we'll look at 2 examples on our next slide, we do not have any passive or active trends that can be applied to all life on Earth. Okay? And in fact, let's look at complexity, because you might argue, well, things do get more morphologically complex. We start out with single-cell bacteria, we get single-celled eukaryotes, we get colonial organisms, and eventually we get multicellular organisms. That seems to be at least a passive trend, because there still are some simple ones around. But that seems to be a passive trend towards more and more and more complexity. However, that's really not valid, because the first organisms living were kind of at the bare minimum anyway, so there's no way possible for us to get less complex and still be considered alive. And in fact, if the reduction hypothesis about the origin of viruses is correct, then that would actually represent a violation of the trend where living organisms became less complex, more and more simple, and became non-living viral entities. So really, even though you might make an argument, they start to fall apart once you very closely examine it. So no passive, no active trends that can be applied to all life on Earth. However, there are definite passive and active trends that we see in the fossil record and even in modern species today. So let's look at two examples. The first is in horses. We talked about horses during our first unit, so it's a good example. You don't need to relearn anything. And we talked about some of the trends that we see in horses. So generally, horse species get larger. It's a active trend in size. Not only that, but they reduce the number of digits on their legs. So we go from 4 in the earliest horses to 3 in the kind of mid-range horses, to finally just 1 digit, that last toe that now modern horses are running on. So there's a trend in increase in size, a trend in loss of digits. There's other trends too, like the way their teeth are specialized for eating grasses. But if you know those two, if you know the digits and the size, you're good. And amongst arthropods as a group, we see a very clear passive trend. So the earliest arthropods had many segments, and they had a leg on each segment up until the anus. And after the anus, there weren't any legs, but there are legs between the head and the anus. Now, since then, many species have specialized those. Instead of just legs, they may have claws or mouth parts or these little swimmerets, or even a tail, which is a modified ancestral leg. And so crustaceans tend to have this passive trend toward having more complex appendages. Now, we call it a passive trend because there still are many species today that still show this ancestral form. So not all of them have become more complex, but some have, and so it's a very clear example of a passive trend among the arthropods.